The chamber, despite its grandeur and scale, felt intimate in its silence. Words echoed not just through the physical space, but through the minds and emotions of those present. Every syllable was measured, deliberate, a blade sharpened by centuries of struggle and memory. No raised voices, no desperate pleas. Only the controlled rhythm of speech born of necessity, a necessity to be heard, to be understood, to matter. Asterisk across the polished floor and beneath the strange constellations rotating slowly in the domed ceiling, two entities faced each other in what resembled a duel not of violence, but of conviction. No blood would be spilled, but the stakes were no less lethal. This was a confrontation where language itself was the battlefield, and the soul of a world hung in the balance. Asterisk, each word delivered struck like a pulse, testing the composure of the one receiving them. The air between them crackled, not with energy fields or weaponry, but with meaning. It was the unspoken weight of defiance carried by every phrase. There was no translation delay, no misunderstanding. The exchange transcended grammar and syntax. It was clarity distilled to its purest form. Beneath the complexity of alien protocol and diplomatic posturing was the raw essence of a species refusing to be erased. Asterisk. Onlookers stood like monuments, expressionless or unreadable by human standards, yet one could feel the tension in their poise. These were not passive witnesses. Each was a sentinel of an empire, a custodian of advanced civilization, perhaps even judges in a tribunal disguised as observation. They bore the memory of countless encounters, perhaps even other civilizations that had failed to speak well enough for their survival. Now another voice attempted what few ever had speak, and pushed back against the tide of annihilation or absorption. Asterisk, no weapons had been drawn, but make no mistake, this was war. War not of technology, but of ideologies. One side operated on logic, superiority, the cold calculus of resources and worth. The other side wielded emotion, history, the intangible weight of identity. And as the words flowed, crafted not just for understanding but for impact, they carried with them the echoes of billions. Cities built, oceans crossed, lives lived, and lost in search of something more. Asterisk, truths were laid bare unflinching, unadorned. Not just truths about achievements, but admissions of failure, of damage done, of wounds inflicted by one's own hands. But within those admissions was the spark of growth. A declaration that imperfection did not equate to inferiority, that to strive, to fall and rise again, was its own kind of greatness. This wasn't an apology. It was a manifesto of existence, asterisk, and in that manifesto was power. Not power in numbers or technology, but in the stubborn refusal to be defined by another. To look into the eyes of something more ancient, more advanced, and still claim the right to determine one's own future. It was not arrogance, nor ignorance. It was the rare kind of courage that grows in the face of overwhelming odds, not the courage to destroy, but the courage to stand unbroken when destruction seems inevitable. Asterisk. The alien form opposite never moved, never interrupted. Its silence wasn't passive. It was calculating, absorbing every nuance. The glow of its intricate circuits shifted subtly, a language in themselves. Perhaps approval, perhaps warning. But the flow of words did not waver, because silence, too, was an answer, and it needed to be met with sound, with meaning. Asterisk, this was the kind of battle no one trained for. There were no protocols, no rehearsals, only the instinct to protect what mattered: home, identity, freedom. Every sentence spoken became a shield, every pause a breath drawn in defiance. Even as uncertainty loomed like a storm, the voice did not break. The rhythm continued, unyielding, steady as heartbeat. Some in the chamber shifted, if only slightly. Perhaps they recognized what they were hearing. Not the elegance of rhetoric, but the weight of truth told without flinching. Perhaps it stirred something in them: curiosity, memory, even respect. Or perhaps not. Perhaps they had heard too many last words before a final silence. But even so, this voice was different. Not because it claimed superiority, not because it promised allegiance, but because it demanded recognition without surrender. And that alone changed everything. The vastness of the chamber seemed to shrink as the dialogue began, narrowing the distance between two very different species in a space filled with tension and unspoken history. There was no need for weapons or physical might. The confrontation unfolding was one of intellect, spirit, and belief. Words, stripped of ornament and loaded with purpose, became the tools of resistance in a contest where survival depended not on force, but on the ability to convey truth. Each phrase was chosen with precision, not just to communicate but to resonate. It wasn't about begging for mercy or offering submission. The language being spoken was a testament, a declaration of a people unwilling to be categorized as expendable. The cadence was even, deliberate, but carried an unmistakable undercurrent of passion. Not the loud, chaotic passion of desperation, but the quiet strength that came from conviction deeply rooted in memory and sacrifice. There was no need to speak of warships or planetary defenses. None of that would matter in a room like this. This was a crucible of ideas, a place where the future would not be written in blood, but in the clarity and honesty of one's voice. The chamber, though cold and calculated in its architecture, now pulsed with something more intent, will, the quiet thunder of a species daring to assert its right to endure. In the silence following each statement, it became clear that this was not just about making a case. It was about presence. The sheer act of standing there, of voicing dissent against an entity so far beyond comprehension, was in itself a statement louder than any battle cry. There was no armor, no allies at hand, no hope of retreat. Only the raw courage to look into the face of judgment and answer not with fear, but with unwavering resolve. The others who watched from the shadows, from seats woven into the structure, like thrones of stone and starlight, bore witness without expression. Their forms flickered with alien biologies and foreign technologies, but their attention was singular. This was not the first trial they had seen. Entire civilizations had passed through this place, some ascending, others disappearing. What stood out now was not power but perspective. What they observed was a species defending itself not with pride or arrogance, but with earned understanding. What was offered in those moments was not perfection. Quite the opposite, it was imperfection embraced. The story told was one of conflict and error, of mistakes made and lessons learned through hardship. It was a story not of superiority, but of humanity's relentless push forward despite itself. There was something disarming about that kind of honesty. Something powerful about a people who knew their own flaws and chose to rise anyway. Every response carried the weight of Earth's complexity, its contradictions, its capacity for destruction, and its greater capacity for creation. For every war fought, there had been peace brokered. For every failure, a recovery. For every cruelty, a gesture of compassion. This wasn't an attempt to convince through appeal. It was a reflection of reality, spoken plainly, without polish. And in that plainness, there was undeniable strength. No promises were made. No future was painted in idealistic colors. Instead, there was an unshakable declaration that life, no matter how chaotic or flawed, had value. That sentience itself, when mixed with the will to grow, was enough reason to be given a chance. The argument did not rest on achievements or potential, but on the essence of what it meant to try to care, to build something meaningful from nothing. The being on the opposite side remained still, yet its presence shifted subtly. Whether it was processing, judging, or merely listening, it was impossible to tell. But silence itself became a kind of dialogue. And so the words continued, not louder, not faster, but with increasing clarity. The voice did not falter. It did not search for approval. It existed simply to say what had to be said. Surrounded by technology so advanced it felt like magic. In the presence of minds that spanned galaxies, there existed only one defense worth offering: the truth. Not a perfect truth. Not a convenient one, but a truth that belonged solely to those who lived it. A truth that demanded nothing but the chance to be acknowledged. In the middle of a chamber forged from alien alloys and cosmic wisdom, the atmosphere grew heavy with judgment. The silence inside wasn't passive. It was thick with potential consequence. At the center of that silence stood a lone voice speaking. For an entire world, for oceans and forests, cities and ruins, joys and regrets. The weight of a planet's fate, with all its wonder and all its wounds, was balanced precariously on each carefully delivered sentence. It wasn't a battlefield in the traditional sense, but the stakes couldn't have been higher. The Earth had been brought to the edge not by missiles or bombs, but by a question. Did it deserve to continue? The voice that rose in response wasn't laced with promises or wrapped in propaganda. Instead, it bore the marks of everything that had come before, of a species scarred by its own history but still willing to defend what remained. Surrounding the speaker were the observers, towering, motionless, some mechanical, some seemingly organic, others too strange to classify. Their forms defied understanding, their stillness almost oppressive. Each one was a symbol of civilizations that had survived far longer, that had ascended to a level where judgment became routine. To them, this may have seemed like one more inquiry, one more potential world under review. But to the speaker, and to the people they spoke for, it was the culmination of everything. The accumulated weight of millennia pressed inward, and yet, the voice did not break. No matter the grandeur of the setting, no matter the cold scrutiny of the watchers, there was strength in the act of standing unshaken. In the heart of foreign power, in the presence of impossible intelligence, Earth did not bow. The words offered were not of submission or apology. They were honest reflections on growth through adversity, on failure and correction, on damage done and the relentless effort to heal. There was no illusion here, no attempt to hide the destruction that had scarred the planet. The pollution, the wars, the greed, they were acknowledged. But so were the victories of compassion, of unity, of progress forged through resistance. It became clear, as the speech continued, that this was more than a defense. It was a confrontation with extinction. Not just the extinction of life, but of culture, memory, and meaning. If Earth were to fall here, if its existence were deemed unworthy, it would not be for lack of power, but for the inability to articulate its own value. That was the fight being waged now, to be seen not as a statistic in a cosmic ledger, but as a world that mattered. All around, the chamber reacted subtly. Walls shimmered with soft pulses of light, symbols flickered in sequences that might have represented emotions, calculations, or both. The observers remained still, yet even they couldn't completely suppress the tension rising through the air. This was a confrontation none could look away from, not because it was loud or dramatic, but because it was deeply, undeniably human. There was no threat embedded in the words, no false humility either. only a direct expression of a species that knew it had done harm, yet had also created beauty, that it had stumbled repeatedly, yet still reached upward, that it had fought, failed, risen again, and still dared to dream. The voice was not there to persuade through fear or flattery. It was there to affirm a right, the right to exist and to continue trying. Asterisk among the gathered watchers, something shifted. Maybe imperceptibly, maybe it was nothing. But even the air felt different, charged by the weight of what had just been spoken. No shields had been raised, no weapons drawn, but something deeper had been revealed, a refusal to disappear quietly. An insistence that even in the face of annihilation, the truth of a world would not go unspoken. Asterisk what emerged was a reflection not of perfection, but of persistence. The enduring idea that imperfection was not a flaw, but a form of potential. That the measure of a species wasn't in its avoidance of mistakes, but in what it did after making them. In that idea lay the core of Earth's defense, not polished words or advanced machines, but raw determination. Asterisk the voice that rang out did not ask for mercy. It demanded recognition, not of dominance, but of worth. Not as a threat, but as a presence. One that had earned its place in the stars not through conquest, but through survival. And that, in the end, was the true challenge offered to the chamber, to see a world not as data or risk, but as life. Asterisk. The chamber was impossibly quiet, as though sound itself had been suspended in anticipation. All movement had ceased. Even the energy coursing through the alien architecture seemed to slow, pulsing in time with the tension in the air. It was a moment balanced delicately on the edge of decision, where the future of an entire species was suspended in the stillness between words. The room, vast and awe-inspiring, was filled with beings from across the stars, intellects, emissaries, and observers who had seen civilizations rise and fall, some by their own hand, others through the cold efficiency of this very process. Asterisk at the center stood one voice. That voice was not elevated by technology or translated through aggression. It stood alone, reliant only on the clarity of thought and the conviction that, no matter how small Earth may seem in the galactic scale, it deserved a place in the greater chorus of life. The tone was steady, not boastful, not fearful, but purposeful. The words formed bridges across species, across philosophies, across time. Asterisk. This was no ceremonial hearing. This was not the negotiation of treaties or the pursuit of alliance. This was judgment. A reckoning cloaked in silence. An entire planet was held to the light, examined not just for what it had built, but for what it believed. It was not the strength of its armies or the scale of its cities that mattered now. What mattered was the soul of the species, its ability to confront a higher power not with subservience, but with integrity. Asterisk. The voice that filled the chamber made no attempt to sound greater than it was. It spoke with the cadence of history, of stories passed from generation to generation, of lessons carved into the bones of mountains and whispered across oceans. It was a voice that carried the laughter of children, the silence of the fallen, the cries of protesters, the songs of distant ancestors. It did not ask to be spared. It insisted on being seen. Asterisk across from that voice stood something ancient and vast beyond flesh, beyond metal, beyond emotion in the way it was known, Earth. The alien form radiated presence without gesture. It absorbed every word in silence, and in that silence, the stakes became clearer with every second. This was not a conversation. It was a test. Asterisk one voice stood in for billions. For languages unspoken in that chamber. For the ones who had died, before ever knowing that there was something more beyond the stars. For the ones not yet born, who might never open their eyes if this moment ended poorly. That voice stood on the precipice of total erasure, and yet it did not yield. It spoke not as one begging for validation, but as one reminding the universe of something it might have forgotten. That value is not measured in perfection, but in persistence. Every word offered up in that chamber carried with it the ache of impermanence. Earth was not perfect. It had faltered, polluted, fought among itself. Its record was stained with injustice, cruelty, ignorance. But alongside those failings had grown things rare and beautiful: empathy, courage, creativity, love. The contradictions weren't hidden. They were laid bare, not as excuses, but as truths. The voice did not mask the flaws. It embraced them as part of what it meant to live, to learn, to evolve. There was no plea, no submission. The voice offered no compromise on dignity. It asked no special favor, only fairness. It offered no flattery, only fact. And in that unwavering steadiness, it became something more than an individual. It became a mirror. It reflected back at the alien tribunal not just what Earth was, but what any civilization might be when stripped to its essence. Hopeful, broken, resilient, alive. As the final words drifted into the air, a strange quiet settled again. Not the expectant silence of waiting, but the charged stillness of something having shifted. Nothing visible had changed. The watchers remained statuesque. The lights continued their slow pulse. The alien form remained unreadable, but something in the room felt altered. Not decided, but different. As though possibility had opened slightly. Wider. The voice that had spoken now faded into the atmosphere of the chamber, but its presence remained. Not through power. Not through fear. But through the undeniable strength of standing alone and speaking the truth when it mattered most.